Hi there, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on your location. The Young Professional Task Force is thankful to you for joining today's webinar entitled The Green Status of a Species, Applying the Green Status of a Species as a Young Professional. Uh, for those of you who are not native English speakers and would like to use subtitles, you can activate it in the caption button and pick the language of your preferences. Before starting, please share with us your name and where are you joining from in the chat box. Also, have in mind that today's session will be recorded and that you can type your questions in the Q&A button. Now, over the next 60 minutes, we will talk about how to implement green status assessments and ways that young professionals can learn about and use this as a tool. And we are going to do this from two of our panelists. The first one is Magdalena Siegen, and the second one is Justin Birkhoff. Magda is the Green Status of a Species Program Officer at the IUCN Red List unit. She leads efforts to support the implementation of the IUCN Green Status of a Species by training assessors worldwide, delivering workshops, and promoting the use of green status assessments in conservation planning and decision making. She has previously worked on conservation research involving African elephant, Madagascar plovers, and other threatened species, and is passionate about supporting the recovery of species and ecosystems while inspiring the next generation of conservationists. On the other hand, Justin is the Vertebrate Conservation Coordinator in the Global Center for Species Survival at the Indianapolis Zoo. He works in strengthened collaborations between ex situ and in situ conservation and supports the specialist group of the IUCN SSC. His work focuses on developing conservation capacity, building partnerships, and equipping conservation professionals with practical skills and innovative tools. He's a strong advocate for mentorship and storytelling in conservation, and he's dedicated to empowering young professionals to become effective leaders in global species conservation. Now, I'm going to stop monopolizing the spotlight and pass it on to Magda. Magda, the stage is all yours.
Thank you, and thank you for the introduction. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. Yeah, do give a shout if you can't. Okay, so the presentation that I'm going to deliver today is just going to be a sort of broad overview of the purpose of the green status of species and the process that goes behind completing an assessment. So whenever I present on the green status, I like to start by posing this question. What does it mean to successfully conserve a species? Is it when a species has reached least concern status on the red list, like the grey whale here, even though this species is still massively depleted compared to pre-whaling levels? Is it when we've conserved a species in a seed bank or a zoo, even if it's extinct in the wild? It's a really difficult question that doesn't have a simple answer. But the green status offers an answer, which is what I'm going to explain in this presentation. So in order to sort of explain this answer that the green status gives, I just want to rewind and describe how we've measured conservation success to date. So the main way that we've measured conservation progress is using the red list, with a move from one of these higher risk categories to one of these lower categories being viewed as a sort of hallmark of conservation success. But the thing is that the red list only measures one thing, extinction risk. And so when we look at changes in red list status, all we're looking at is change in extinction risk. And as conservationists, we need to ask ourselves, is it enough just to avoid extinction? If we look at a spectrum of a species recovery, a species that is 100% fully recovered would be fully ecologically functional and at a low risk of extinction throughout its historical range. Now, a species that is extinct in the wild on the red list is, of course, always going to correspond to 0% on the recovery spectrum. But at the other end, this relationship is a lot less clear. A species might be least concern on the red list because it's naturally quite widespread and hasn't declined recently, but it could still be significantly depleted compared to its historical fully recovered benchmark. We don't know based on the least concern categorization alone. But it's important to know because if a species is a long way from being fully recovered, it won't be performing its ecological functions at a baseline level in its whole historical range. And that is going to propel the deterioration and even collapse of those ecosystems where it's not fully functional. So just because a species is least concern doesn't necessarily mean our work is done. And that, in a nutshell, is the knowledge gap that the green status exists to fill. So what exactly is the green status? It is a new IUCN assessment that is complementary to, but also a part of, the Red List. So it's not aiming to compete with the Red List, it's included on the Red List website, and it's updated according to the same publication cycles as the Red List. And our ultimate goal is for all species to have their complementary red list and green status categories displayed alongside each other, like you can see for the Saiga here. So what are the objectives of the green status? It has two key objectives. First, to provide a standardized framework for measuring species recovery, and second, to assess the impact of and incentivize conservation action towards a state of full recovery. Let's start by having a look at objective number 1, measuring species recovery. Of course, in order to measure recovery, we first have to define what exactly we mean by recovery. And the green status defines a fully recovered species as a species that is viable and ecologically functional in each part of its indigenous range. So it splits the concept of recovery into these 3 components: viability, ecological functionality, and spatial representation. And now I'm going to very quickly show you how the green status measures species recovery based on this definition. So I'm going to take you through the broad steps of completing a green status assessment. So the first step is to define the species' indigenous range, which is its current range plus its range prior to major human impacts. And this provides us with a sort of spatial benchmark to measure recovery against. Next, we divide that indigenous range into biologically based spatial units and assess the current status of the species in each of those spatial units. So each unit can be assessed as one of 4 categories: absent, present, viable, or functional, absent being the worst, and functional being the best, representing a fully functional, fully recovered population. Now, each of these categories has a weighting attached to it, and so each spatial unit is assigned the relevant score based on that weighting. And in a nutshell, all those scores get put into an equation. All of this is done automatically, and it churns out a final percentage score representing where the species falls on this recovery spectrum. And we call this the green score or the species recovery score. And for this hypothetical species, the score would be 42%, representing a species that is 42% of the way along the spectrum to being fully recovered. A category is then assigned based on that score, and for a species with a score of 42%, the category would be largely depleted. And just to show you what the other categories are, 0% gets extinct in the wild, between 0 and 20 is critically depleted, between 20 and 50 is largely depleted, between 50 and 80 is moderately depleted, between 80 and 100 is slightly depleted, and then 100 is fully recovered or non-depleted if it's never been depleted. And what these different categories do is they provide us, similarly to the Red List, they provide us with a standardized language for talking about this recovery depletion aspect of a species conservation status, which until now has been largely overlooked. Okay, so I've covered objective number 1 of the green status. Now let's look at objective number 2, which is to assess the impact of and incentivize conservation action towards a state of full recovery. So this objective has 4 sort of sub-objectives, which are first, to recognize conservation achievements, second, to highlight species whose current status depends on continued conservation, third, to forecast the expected impact of planned conservation, and fourth, to elevate levels of ambition for long-term recovery. So how exactly does the green status fulfill this second objective? Well, I've already briefly discussed how we calculate a current green score for a species, the species recovery score, but we don't stop there. We can use a combination of modelling and inference to estimate the score at different past and future points in time. So what was the score in 1950? We call this the former scenario. What do we expect the score to be in 10 years' time if all planned conservation goes ahead? We call this the future with conservation scenario. And where could the score go in 100 years' time if we do all the conservation that we possibly can and our only barriers are the species' biological limits and a lack of available land? And we call this the long-term aspiration scenario. So we have 4 different scores for these 4 different scenarios. But we still don't stop there. We can use counterfactual reasoning to estimate what the score would be without conservation. So what would the score be today if no past conservation had ever happened? And we call this the current without conservation hypothetical scenario. And finally, what will the score be in 10 years if conservation stops now overnight? And we call this the future without conservation hypothetical scenario. So in total, we have 6 different scores for 6 different scenarios with and without conservation. Now, by looking at the difference between the scores with conservation and without conservation, we can derive information about conservation impact. So the difference between the current score and the current without conservation score we call the conservation legacy. In other words, the impact of conservation so far. The difference between the current score and the future without conservation score we call conservation dependence. And this shows us what we stand to lose if conservation were to stop. The difference between the current and the future with conservation score we call conservation gain, the expected short-term gains from planned conservation. And finally, the difference between the current score and the long-term aspiration tells us the species' recovery potential. So we have these 4 different conservation impact metrics, and each one of these metrics fulfills each one of those 4 sub-objectives that I showed you on the previous slide. So conservation legacy helps us to recognise conservation achievements. Conservation dependence highlights species that are dependent on continued conservation. Conservation gain forecasts the expected impact of planned conservation. And then recovery potential elevates levels of ambition for long-term recovery. And similarly to the headline species recovery score, these metrics are initially expressed as a percentage, and then a category is assigned based on that percentage. And the categories can be high, medium, low, or zero, representing high, medium, low, or zero conservation impacts. It can theoretically be negative if conservation has actually had an adverse impact. And then ID, this is indeterminate for cases where we're not sure what impact conservation has had. So just to really illustrate why these conservation impact metrics are so valuable and important, I want to take you through a few examples, starting with the mountain chicken, which despite the name is actually a frog from the Caribbean. And yeah, I just want to illustrate conservation legacy through this species. So as you can see, this is a critically endangered species, and it has been critically endangered for over 20 years as a result of threats like chytrid fungus, hunting, habitat loss, so forth. Now, some people might look at this and say, well, we've invested a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of effort into conserving this species, and yet in 20 years, it's not improved from being critically endangered. So clearly our resources are being wasted and we should stop bothering. But the green status tells us that this species has a high conservation legacy. And that's because without conservation actions like a ban on hunting the species and importing invasive predators, it's almost certain that the species would be extinct today. So even though conservation hasn't improved the red list status, it definitely, well, almost definitely has prevented extinction, which is a huge conservation impact that the red list on its own doesn't capture, but the green status conservation legacy metric does. For conservation gain, I want to discuss the Philippine crocodile. And this is another critically endangered species. It's declined by 82% over 3 of the species' generations. And as you can see, it's been lost from really the vast majority of its historical range. All of these red areas in the map are areas where it's now extinct. And again, some people might look at this and say, well, this is a lost cause. This is not a good place to invest our resources. But the green status tells us that conservation gain is high for this species. And that's because there are people working in the background to plan reintroductions to some of these red areas on the map. And as a result of those reintroductions, the number of occupied spatial units is expected to double over the next decade. And this really sends the message that just because conservation impacts haven't come to fruition yet, it doesn't mean we should give up, because success could be right around the corner. Next, for conservation dependence, I want to show you the giant panda. So this assessment isn't published yet, so you're getting a bit of a sneak preview. But the backstory to this species is that it was downlisted from a more severe red list category of endangered to a less severe category of vulnerable in 2016, which is obviously a fantastic conservation success story. But actually, a lot of panda conservationists were concerned about this because the fact that the species isn't endangered anymore might mean that it's less eligible for conservation support and resources. And what this red list downlisting doesn't tell us is that maintaining the vulnerable status is highly dependent on continued resourcing, continued conservation, and continued support. If we were to stop doing things like supplementary feeding and intensive captive breeding, the species would rapidly go back to endangered. And yeah, the red list category improvement really doesn't capture this conservation dependence. But the green status assessments will. We're expecting that this species will have a high conservation dependence, which provides really strong grounds for continued support and funding, even though the red list category is getting less and less severe. Last but not least, for recovery potential, I want to show you this really cool example of the Ryotan ground partula snail, which, as you can see, is extinct in the wild as a result of invasive predators. Now, again, a lot of people would look at a species that is extinct in the wild and think, this is a lost cause, this is not somewhere to invest resources, this would be a waste of money and time. But the green status tells us that this species has a high recovery potential. And that's because successful captive breeding is already underway for this species, and introduction sites have been identified outside the species' original range. And if those introductions go ahead and are successful, there's long-term potential to establish functional populations in multiple areas. So yeah, this shows us that a species' red list status doesn't necessarily determine its recovery potential. And sometimes extinct in the wild species are still worthy of effort and investments. So I've now covered the two objectives of the green status and hopefully convinced you of their value. Um, so yeah, just to sort of finish off, I just want to talk about where we are today with the green status. So this is a pretty new metric. At the moment, we've only got 182 published assessments. So we're massively playing catch up to the roughly 180,000 published red list assessments. But there are 2,000 assessments, roughly 2,000 assessments ongoing or committed. So this is an area that's rapidly growing, which is really exciting. And in terms of resources available, if you're interested in finding out more about the green status, there are a range of different guidance documents online. There's also a free online course available through the Red List website, and it has English, Spanish, and French versions. There are several pre-recorded presentations and webinars, including this one now. And also, if you end up in a situation where you're involved in doing a green status assessment, help, advice, and support is available from me in the Red List units. So yeah, that's all I'm going to say for today about the green status. I'm looking forward to your questions in a little bit, but for now, I'm going to hand over to Justin, who is going to do a short presentation. Justin, you're on mute. You've been on mute.
Thank you. I appreciate that. You figure at this point we know how to do this. Thanks, Magda. So we're going to talk a little bit about how you can use the green status in the work that you're already doing and how it can supplement and support some of your work. So again, it's an integrated part of the Red List, so it's a complementary piece to talk about recovery and really using that as the benchmark of how you share your stories, but also how you apply for grants. I touch again, the objective is to create this standardized framework. So most everyone in the conservation world is very familiar with the Red List statuses. When we talk about species that are endangered, vulnerable, this is a common language that we're all very familiar with. And so using the green status words and definitions allows us to have a shared understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about recovery. Again, we're trying to improve and incentivize conservation action. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the second set, they assess the impact of and incentivize conservation action, talk about how we recognize achievements, but also how we frame the work that we're doing or the work that we're planning in through a recovery lens and how we can use the green status to gain support and gain funding for some of our work. So this is also going to work off of a green status assessment that hasn't yet been published. It's on the Orangefjord River Bream. And if you look at this map, you can see it's South Africa and Eswatini is where we're going to find them. And that little orange dot is the original range, and that little blue dot is a reintroduced site. And so get a little bit closer in and see what our fish looks like. So it is a critically endangered species. It was last assessed the last assessment was published in April of this year. So this is very recent information. It's an endemic to the lower reaches of the Lamani River in South Africa and Eswatini. The original range was approximately 97 kilometers of river. So a fairly good distance for a small fish. And in the 70s is when that reintroduced population was first put into Kruger National Park. So recent survey work, collecting data is important so we can inform what we're working on and framing how we're going to best approach it. Found that this population is restricted to less than 3 kilometers of the upper Lamani River, and there's no records in South Africa except for one translocated population in one dam in Kruger National Park. So it's a roughly 90% reduction in the extent of the area of occurrence, and there's been a large population drop. So it's a critically endangered species. There's very good data that supports this. And so it's also, with its freshly minted green status that hasn't quite yet made it to publication, it's a largely depleted species. And you can see that these populations are not particularly close to each other and they cross international boundaries. So what we're going to talk about is how this group is using this information as part of its application for funding. So the Indianapolis Zoo runs a couple of different granting programs every year, and this actually came from their application to us for the Wild Futures Grant. It's a smaller grant, so, up to about $5,000. And so two members of the freshwater fish specialist group who have been working on this species for a while um, gave a little bit of a background on what they've been working on. So there's an ongoing conservation breeding program. They have bred over 2,000 individuals, and they've reintroduced about 2,700 animals with a mixture of animals that are caught in the wild as well as this captive bred population. And so they're being reintroduced into their original range and to a number of artificial dams that are within that range as well. So we're seeing an expansion of the population's locations. They have ongoing monitoring programs for these dams, assess how the introductions are doing, how the population is doing, and they have a goal. They want to stock at least 10 more dams with these fish. And the ask within their grant application was to fund the monitoring as well as some of the collections. And so we talked a little bit about this conservation legacy, conservation dependence, gain, and recovery potential. And this is the language that they used in their application. So their green status score shows that they have a high potential for improved conservation status using the actions that they have. So there's ongoing programming, and they have assessed that long term it's going to be quite positive for the species. That conservation gain in the short term is high. So that 10-year window based on everything that they know and every action that is planned, we see a huge potential for conservation gain. This is based on the recent translocations to two new spatial units that are outside of the indigenous range, so that expansion of range through translocation. So they believe that this population will become fully established and free ranging in the wild within the next couple of years, which would change the population as well as its area of occupancy. They also are planning on restocking two indigenous spatial units, so two parts of their original range. And they believe that those two populations will no longer be threatened within the next 10 years. And as I mentioned earlier, the recovery potential is really high with continued restocking. So this ongoing conservation breeding program, their removal of the invasive predator. So there's an invasive bass species, which is part of the reason that their population has declined so dramatically. And then also plans for education, outreach, behavior change, and enforcement to prevent more of these bass coming in. And there is, based on all of the things that they've been able to pull in, their experience, that full recovery is feasible in the long term. So, they the way that they make the case for, we want you to fund part of our project is this is where we are, this is where we're going, and these are the benchmarks that we foresee moving along as we go with this. And so, when we talk about how, the green status as an assessment tool is, we're using this common language, we're able to define what recovery parameters are available to us, but we're also able to communicate it to somebody who doesn't know anything about our projects or anything about the species that we're working on or the places that we work in. And so, when the green status, the value of it is not just as a measuring tool, but also as a conservation or storytelling tool. And that these are the opportunities that exist within the work that you're doing, but also within the specialist groups. So that's all of my slides. We have opportunity for questions. If people don't have questions, Elad has prepared some for us as well. So we'll go from there. I think the first question in the Q&A box is most likely going to be Magda's best to answer is what type of field data is most valuable for conducting a GSS assessment?
Yeah, so thanks for this question. The answer I would say is, first of all, similar data to the Red List. So things like population size, trends, habitat condition, trends in habitat condition, particularly not just at the global level, but also at the subglobal level, the regional level or local level, because the green status is this spatially explicit framework. But the other type of data that the green status needs, which the red list doesn't, is historical baseline data. So yeah, things like literature review, historical occurrence records, yeah, just even fossil, studies of fossils and whatnot, just to provide that sort of spatial benchmark of the species indigenous range to tell us what we should be aiming for when it comes to species recovery. Yeah, I hope that answers that question.
I think it does. The next question, I'm going to steal Elad's job for a second, is how is the green status species different from IUCN Red List and practical conservation planning? So both of us touched on it. It is a complementary piece of the Red List. And so they tell two sides of the same story. And so when we talk about using that red list, is that risk of extinction is, there's an urgency of protecting species and preventing them from going extinct. And the green status focuses on recovery. And so preventing extinctions is important. Losing species is not something that we want to do, but ultimately we want to recover these species so they're performing their ecological functions. And so when you talk about it in conservation planning phrase is that you can use both sides of these to complement each other and to really focus in on what your actions and activities are. So halting decline of a species population or the loss of its habitat or range restriction is one way to frame an action. And then your next action or activity is, and then this is how we're going to recover that species. And we're going to either grow its habitat, its population, its range. And so they are two pieces of the same conversation, and you can use them interchangeably to frame what your actions and activities, long-term outcomes are going to be. Magda, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, maybe just perhaps to say that in particular, the conservation impact metrics help to provide a roadmap for future conservation planning. So things like conservation gain and recovery potential tell us what conservation actions we need to be doing in the short term and the long term to promote recovery of this species. So in addition to being a sort of monitoring tool, the green status is also a roadmap to recovery.
Great. Thanks, Justin, Micah, for taking on the Q&A questions. Also, let's take I'm about whole question in how is the green status species? I know it's different from the IUCN Red List that we covered that. Is it possible to do assessment on the species that has no baseline?
So Elon's connection's failing on us. So is it possible to do an assessment on a species that has no baseline population estimates?
Yes, absolutely. I'd say the vast majority of species do not have baseline population estimates, right, when we're looking back hundreds of years. So the way that a green status assessment works is we're not measuring recovery against a baseline population estimate, but against a baseline indigenous range, assuming that at a historical time, the species was fully ecologically functional throughout that indigenous range. So the data that we need for setting the recovery baseline is data about the historical range of the species. And that can be based on, things like historical records and fossil evidence, but it can also be based on inference, based on sort of habitat suitability and how habitat suitability has changed. So yeah, there's a range of different data sources that we can draw on to estimate the species indigenous range, its recovery baseline, and I'd say for almost all species, we know enough to be able to infer roughly what that baseline looked like.
So the second part that Naomi added to that question is examples pangolins, where a lot of the red list assessment is being completed based on hunting rates as a proxy. So again, things that we can infer, we don't need to know, an exact population. It's very much about how the trend is. And yeah, so that was that was a great example, and I'm gonna leave that. To what extent are historical conservation efforts considered in a green status assessment? For instance, if a species benefited from conservation actions several decades ago, are those actions reflected in the conservation legacy metric, and how is their long-term impact evaluated?
Yeah, so as I sort of showed you in my presentation, we in order to calculate conservation legacy, we estimate a score for the species now, what it is now in real life, and what it would have been now if past conservation hadn't taken place. And when we justify that estimated counterfactual score, you provide information, details of the past conservation actions that have taken place and how they've influenced that score. So for sure, we take into account past conservation actions. When it comes to the sort of long-term outlook for species, you'd not just consider the residual impact of past conservation actions, but also the impact of planned conservation actions and potential conservation actions that we could do if we had more resources. So yeah, the sort of long-term recovery potential metric takes into account both past conservation actions, ongoing conservation actions, and potential desirable conservation actions. Yeah, I hope that answers that question.
Yeah. And so I think something that we're also going to touch on and that I think connects really nicely to that is how young professionals can get involved in green status assessments. So as Magda said, there's a bunch of resources. But there's also a course that you can take, and there's a series of knowledge tests in that. But it is a really good way to start to contribute to the global conservation community. So a lot of it is going to be, bench-based, right? As a lot of it's going to be research, it's going to be literature reviews, and it allows these green statuses foundationally to be built out. You don't need to be an expert in a species to do a good literature review. Had an intern in our office last summer who did two green statuses and took them about 85-90% of the way on two species that she had never studied before through a literature review. And what this allows you to do is create experience, but it also allows you to connect with different specialist groups and different experts within those groups and have conversations about what conservation actions are in the past, what things are planned, and use those experts to build out these green statuses. So one of the things is, although partially it's because it's a relatively new metric in the IUCN knowledge products, the other portion of it is they can be somewhat time consuming. And so it's a great way for students or early career professionals to build some experience in this space, but also support these assessments being published because it takes some time to do. And so one of the ideas behind this conversation is looking at ways that young professionals can get involved. And so, 2,000 planned assessments that's a lot of work that needs to be done, and they all need to be reviewed. And so there's opportunities for people to get involved either with species that they already are working on, or maybe even species that they're not, to build these assessments out so that we can continue to publish them and then be able to utilize them in conservation planning, use it as a metric of recovery for species around the globe.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. Sort of Justin mentioned that he had an intern working on assessments which are going to be published soon. We've had multiple examples of young people, students even, authoring green status assessments with the support of species experts, sometimes as part of their thesis, sometimes as part of an internship. And we found those collaborations to be really, really successful. In my experience, working with young professionals, they're some of the most sort of diligent and capable assessors that I've worked with. And we're really sort of keen to promote this way of doing assessments with young people's involvement. We've even had examples of young people who worked on green status assessments as students as part of their thesis, who then went on to get, after graduating, went on to get paid roles within the Species Survival Commission of IUCN, working sort of doing green status assessments. We have a young person working in the Centre for Species Survival in Kent, a young person working on green status assessments in Centre for Species Survival in New Mexico, and another one who's kind of on track to get a similar sort of role as well, who's currently doing an internship. So yeah, it's a really exciting new area of conservation assessment to get involved in. And yeah, I think the number of opportunities are only going to grow.
Yeah.
Great. Guys, just a quick sound check. Do you hear me well now?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Great. Finally. Okay, so just a few more questions. What are the main barriers young people face when trying to enter or to stay as a green status assessor?
So like much of the IUCN experience, a lot of this is volunteer based. And so time is, the ability to balance your time between your work life, your normal life, and this is something that, has to be taken into consideration. So as Magda mentioned, there are a number of people who are in the process or have positions that pay them to help them do this, often in tight collaboration with SSC specialist groups. And we expect those roles to increase in number, but we don't necessarily expect that to happen quickly. So part of this
Mhm.
is through the spirit of volunteerism. And so part of the reason that this is lagging behind is because people have to fit it into the cracks of their days, and balance their lives with this. And it's something that we acknowledge that not everyone is capable of doing. But if it is something you're capable of doing and interested in doing, we would love to have more young professionals doing assessments. It's very different in many ways than Red List assessments. A lot of the information is the same, but the manner in which the information is interpreted is different. And so we have a huge contingency of Red List assessors across the different taxonomic specialist groups, and they're all very good at doing Red List assessments. And we're asking them to do something that's a bit different. And so this is a skill set that is still developing within the IUCN SSC community. And this is a great opportunity for a young professional to build a skill set that is going to grow in value. And it's not something that there's a lot of people doing already. And so we think it has a lot of really strong potential, but as it is still a relatively new metric that we use in the SSC, it's still a skill set that we're continuing to grow and mature.
Thanks. Magda, any other barriers,
Yeah, I
challenges?
mean, I think Justin covered that really well, actually. I think just we've sort of there are a lot of young people that are really enthusiastic about the green status, which is wonderful to see. Perhaps the main barrier is just the limited capacity in the conservation sector, which includes limited capacity to, train and support young people. But, that said, when we've been able to involve young people in the green status, it's been extremely successful. And yeah, just to emphasize that you don't have to be a species expert. You just need the skills to be able to review the literature on a species, communicate with willing species experts, and apply the green status criteria.
Great.
And I think one more thing to add to that is we're seeing a strong shift towards recovery as the primary outputs for conservation and conservation activities. So if you didn't see or hear about it, the Phoenix Species Project that was launched on Tuesday with a partnership between the Bezos Earth Fund and Rewild is focused on recovery. Is how do we recover the 100, you know, critically endangered or extinct in the wild species? And the green status is the metric they're using to measure that recovery. And so when we say that this is an opportunity that is growing, we're not 100% sure how it's going to grow, but seeing the kinds of resources that impactful organizations are starting to put into this recovery specific space is really, really exciting. And we anticipate that there will be more of this moving forward.
Great. There's a question in the chat box asking if there is any document for further support.
Yeah, so I'm just copying the link to a page that contains all the sort of resources and guidelines on the green status. And I've just posted that link in the chat. So yeah, hopefully you can see that. That includes things like the green status standards, so the sort of main guidance document, plus some more detailed guidance documents, and yeah, sort of who to contact if you're interested and so forth.
Great. Thanks for doing that, Magda. Also, quick one. How does the green status of a species approach differ from other models, and what makes it effective or inclusive?
Um,
Go go ahead. I'll think about it a bit more.
yeah, so I mean, I guess we've kind of, already covered how the green status focuses on recovery, and so it's sort of helping to spur this paradigm shift away from preventing extinction and towards promoting recovery, which is a sort of new way of looking at things. Something that I think that's really worth highlighting is something that I touched on in the presentation, but the fact that the green status uses counterfactual reasoning. So it imagines where the species would be today without past conservation and where it could be in the future if conservation were to stop now. And because of that use of counterfactual reasoning, the green status approach recognizes more different types of conservation. So it doesn't just acknowledge conservation that results in a reduced extinction risk or that results in recovery gains. It also recognizes conservation that mitigates declines, right? Or that prevents extinction, which is really important because a huge amount of conservation work does exactly that without actually actively promoting recovery. So yeah, I think these things are really important to recognize. They also often take place at a local or regional level as opposed to a global level. And because the green status is spatially explicit, it recognizes those different types of actions at those local levels as well. So yeah, do you have anything to add, Justin?
I think two big things. So I think the spatially explicit part is important. So mostly when we talk about green status, we talk about it on a kind of on a global scale. But it's scalable. You know, we're seeing countries do national level green statuses. So using the green status to measure recovery for target four, for global biodiversity. And so using that as the measure of how are we recovering species within our own national borders. We're in the process, and by we, I mean somebody else who understands this way better than I do, of how do we scale it down to project level. So not just, on a national level, but if you are working in a country that, on a specific species, how are the efforts that you are putting forth part of this larger tapestry of conservation effort for that species? How is that contributing to recovery? And so we're able to start to scale it. And so being able to move between those sort of three major levels using the same language and they all tie into each other is really, really important. And I think it's an added value that we don't see in other metrics. Um, and I think that's really one of the larger strengths for it. I think the other one is this fine measurement of the activities that the red list statuses don't necessarily measure or capture and communicate well, because that's not what it was designed to do. I think the example of the mountain frog or the giant panda are really, really important is, that all of these activities and actions are keeping a species critically endangered. And that is, that right now is the best opportunity. And how do we change that so we bend the curve back towards recovery? Or, the downlisting of a species because the population is recovering is a victory, but it doesn't mean that we're done. And that the green status is able to measure how ongoing activities and how planned activities will continue to either keep that animal or plant or fungi at its new status or continue to improve its overall recovery. And so I think those are the things that really allow this metric to be really, really valuable and where we see it differentiate from some of the other metrics or systems that we see commonly in our space. Um, yeah, there was a question that came in. What about endemic species? So an endemic species is a great example. You can do a green status for an endemic species, and it becomes both your global and your national level status at the same time. So that's, a nice silver lining with that. But the green status, again, designed to be is spatially explicit. And so those spatial units scale with the need, for lack of a better term, and Magda may correct me on that, but it allows you to fine tune it to the level that you need it to. And so if you have an endemic species, you're not your country may be the larger spatial unit, but perhaps it's not its indigenous range is not across the entirety of it. Is like your spatial units become smaller and smaller and become more and more defined. And so we look at things like invertebrates, where speciation becomes quite massive within relatively close geographic distance, is that your entire endemic range may be a valley. And the northern part may be one spatial unit, the southern part may be another. And so you can scale it to that level of detail, and the system still works.
Right. Just a quick one before wrapping this up. Uh, any advice that you would, or any advice that you could give to young professionals who want to get involved in species recovery and green status assessments?
So I put the link for the IUCN Young Professional Task Force in earlier, but joining the Young Professional Task Force, if you're not part of it already, is a great way to join a network of young professionals, students and early career professionals, and some mid-career professionals that are working in this space. Joining specialist groups, if you can, and you may or may not be able to, is a great way to do it. As far as getting involved in green statuses, is reach out. We're interested in supporting people becoming more involved as assessors. There is limited scope to a certain extent. There's only a certain number of people that are, really in a position to help train at this point, but we're looking to grow that and grow the ability to do that. So it is that is an opportunity. I would say that the online course that Magda mentioned in her presentation is a great way to get started. So we're looking to create more opportunities for people, but also realizing that there is limited capacity because there's still a limited number of people that are well trained in this space. So I think there are opportunities for it. And also when you in the work that you're doing, if you are already working in this space, you can really start to look at it in that recovery lens. Is what's it going to take to recover the species that I'm working on or my organization is working on, and you can start to use green statuses principles to define that work and to really guide where your work is going to go.
Thanks. Magda?
Hi, sorry, my computer just crashed when you asked that question. I've just managed to get back in, but my camera's not working. Would you mind repeating the question?
Any advice that would you like to give to young professionals that want to be engaged as green status assessors?
Yeah, so sorry if I repeat what Justin said because I missed what he said. So my first piece of advice would be to take the Green Status online course. You can access it through the Red List website. It's free. It's available in English, Spanish, and French. That will, equip you with knowledge of the Green Status methodology so that you can undertake an assessment. Um, Next, if you have a particular species in mind that you think would benefit from a green status assessment, I would suggest contacting the relevant IUCN specialist group, and reaching out to them and saying, I've trained in how to do the green status, and I'm really interested in helping in doing a green status assessment for this particular species. I'm happy to do the majority of the work. Would you be available to answer any questions and provide expertise where needed? And yeah, collaborations like that involving young professionals and species experts in the IUCN species specialist groups. When we've had them, they've been really successful. So yeah, that's what I would suggest.
Thanks, Amanda, and thanks, Justin, for this great talk. It was really inspiring and loaded with insights. Uh, Today's discussion has reinforced like three messages. The green status species is a key tool for young professionals that can bring to the table for ensure species recovery and assessments. Uh, Collaboration is key. Please reach out, connect with people, and please take the course. It would be a good tool to have in mind. Connect between the GSS assessor and experts will amplify the impact and drivers for species recovery. And hands-on experience is vital. We must support young conservationists in assessing novel skills and learning. That being said, I want to wrap up saying that this conversation does not end here. Each of us has a role to play in and sharing for the future of conservation. So I'm eager and waiting for you to join in for our next webinars. Please connect, reach out, email us. We're open to answer all of your concerns. Thanks again, Justin and Magda, for helping us with this webinar and for all the knowledge that you share with us.
You're welcome. And thank you so much for attending and or watching the recording. We do appreciate it. And we do these because we want to help young professionals find a place that they feel that they can contribute.
Yeah, completely agreed. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming.
All right. Bye, guys.
Thanks, guys, and to all the attendees. We're here for you. See ya.